Hi there, my name is Bethany Turley. I'm an undergraduate student at The Ohio State University in Columbus, Ohio.
I'm Jess, Lamar, Reece, Holler. I'm a graduate student at Western Kentucky University and the University of Pennsylvania in Philadelphia. And our talk today is called Folklore and Environments, Methods in Documenting Vernacular Cultures of Response to Environmental Change. Thanks for being with us.
As we all know, we're in the epoch of the Anthropocene. And this has caused a huge debate in the humanities about who is to blame and when the Anthropocene started, all kinds of things like that. And we've taken up the question of how does the discipline of folklore speak to and learn from the environmental humanities.
So one of the things we're particularly interested in is the way that folkloristic practice, despite having a really different disciplinary history from the environmental humanities, can maybe provide a usable path that can be part of the future of environmental humanities practice. So we have a quote up here today from Joni Adamson from one of the early issues of Resilience, which is one of the leading journals in environmental humanities, and we take great inspiration in Resilience. And Adam's quote is really speaking to the necessity of EH scholars turning to vernacular senses of landscape, vernacular ecologies. And she quotes the great cultural landscape theorist J.B. Jackson, but there's no mention in this discussion of the role of folklorists in documenting environmental cultures or the context in which cultural texts arise. So that's something we really want to speak to today.
Okay, as we've seen, the environmental humanities is producing a lot of really great theory, exploring the emergence of a new sense of expertise in the humanities about nature and environments, and assessing the human roles in the ecosystem. And we're interested in exploring also not just high theory, but a more humble theory of folklore that pays attention to vernacular understandings of environment and nature, as opposed to just top-down sort of high theoretical perspectives.
We also feel like folklore can really speak to EH's turn to sort of an ethics of care, both in academic communities, but also a sort of collaborative outreach practice with all kinds of communities that are impacted by living in Anthropocene times. So, folklore and environments. We hope to cobble together here a brief and we will say speculative history of what is the discipline of folklore and how has it grappled with environments defined variously to provide a usable path for environmental humanities, more engaged and community-based futures. Of course, this is not an official history. These are just moments that we think are really fruitful when put into conversation together. So we hope in the slides to follow to assess the relevance of folkloristic theory and practice and history to environmental humanities scholarship, and to gather that history together with an eye to Anthropocene urgencies and concerns. And in the last turn in our talk, we will look to a couple of case studies in our own ongoing folkloristic work around, in particular, place-based environmental justice and ecological concerns, to look to some models and methods that we hope will be useful to the wider EH community.
So, what is folklore? Folklore is a discipline, and it is often thought of as somewhere between like studying literary texts and anthropology, but it's not just about genre and it's not just about text. There's a lot of focus also on context and performance and materials. And the folk aren't just rural people or people who are out there. We are all the folk, and we are all can be studied through folklore. And in addition to this, folklore has a long history of being engaged in public and applied work, which we'll be talking about later in the presentation.
So these are just a couple of recent texts in folklore study. There are a number of different genres that folklorists deal with. We traditionally say that folklorists work with oral and customary and material cultures, but there's a whole range of genres within that. Folklorists work in ethnomusicology and look at vernacular music cultures, occupational folklore and labor lore, foodways and other material culture studies. We study vernacular architecture and cultural landscapes, folk narrative, which can include legends, rumors, belief, and more traditional folk tales. There's also a healthy and robust field, folkloristics of health and medicine, study of festival and performance genres and beyond, especially the interplay of those genres in more complex situations. So the early history of folk studies, basically folklore has always been into context, which as we interpret it are very similar to environments in many ways. Early folklore was really motivated by a method called the historic geographic method, which was a way of tracing folkloristic texts as they moved through places and the way that they changed and got modified as they moved into different regions. This was C.W. von Sydow's idea of the oikotypification of a folk text. So folklorists were very interested in place and environment and context as something that shaped text. In the 1930s in the U.S. context, we saw the rise of the Archive of the American Folk Song, now the Library of Congress's American Folklife Center, and the Works Progress Administration projects like the States Guides pictured here, which were also very concerned with the way that culture rises in particular places and situations and is tied to bioregionalism, is tied to seasonal rounds and land-based practices in particular geographies. And in the 1960s, folklore went through what we call the performative or the narrative turn, and that moved folklore away from being concerned with just texts to being much more interested in context, events, dynamics of performance. And we argue really opened folklore up to being much more environmental, both in terms of being about green environments and what we think of as ecological practices, and looking at the complex interplay of people and their surrounds interpreted broadly.
So, what we're calling the rise of folklife studies is what Jess had mentioned, is sort of turn to not just focusing on genres and texts, but to focusing on like whole ways of living, the lifestyle of people, and their material objects, their material culture. This is largely pioneered by Don Yoder, who taught at the University of Pennsylvania, and is a model based off the folklife movement in Scandinavia. He edited a journal called Pennsylvania Folklife that was established under the title Pennsylvania Dutchman. Don Yoder's vision was of a folklife movement that was more populist and targeted towards a wide readership, and also coincided with the rise of organized folklife festivals across the U.S.
So the 1960s and 1970s are kind of a blessed and heyday time, both for the environmental protection movement in the U.S. and also for the rise of a codified system of public folklore. So we've kind of put these two things together on a timeline, and as you can see, the very same eras and sort of cultural concerns and movements and legislation that gave us the Smithsonian Folklife Festival, the American Folklife Preservation Act around the bicentennial, and the rise of state folklore programs also gave us the Clean Air Act, the Clean Water Act, the rise of a robust EPA and its own kind of cultural and community study efforts. So these things very much grow up together. And both movements, we've noticed, are very concerned about conservation and preservation of the good, of clean air, of wilderness, of cultural traditions that may be threatened and are perceived as really important to the history of different communities or to nations. And one of the things we want to consider now in the era of a recognized Anthropocene is the kind of conversation between conservation and maintenance, something like the Yucca Mountain Standards or COP21, which are really about maintaining ways of life that are unsustainable, maintaining toxicity into future times. So we're really interested in how this kind of like maintenance culture around the environmental world we find ourselves in or have created now has implications for the sort of cultural conservation we're involved in.
So another important moment in folklore's history is the rise of cultural conservation, which was sort of thinking through cultural preservation and environmental preservation together by thinking about like how to preserve traditional folk life while also preserving the environments that allow for people to practice that traditional folk life at the same time. So here there was a desire to figure out how to build like interdisciplinary collaborative teams around these diverse ideas and applications.
This is a movement that grew out mostly in the 1980s. So this chicken book you see here by Ormond Loomis was a call from Congress to find a way to think more robustly about the conservation of culture and ecology together, as Bethany said. And then this led to a gathering later on in the early 90s of folklorists, historic preservationists, biologists who had all worked together on these like massive new collaborative studies and models, which we think is like a really rich past for EH to look to. It's looking to the same sort of distant disciplinary collaborations. And this also resulted in a book that came out in 1994, edited by Mary Hufford, which summarizes the results of some of those really remarkable studies. So we're going to just talk really briefly through a couple of the really specific folklife studies that came out of this heyday of cultural conservation and look to them as a model for some of our own emergent work.
Mary Hufford is a really important figure in this conserving culture movement. Her folklife surveys in New Jersey and West Virginia really focused on the idea of the mixed mesophytic forests as commons, and looking at practices like wildcrafting of ginseng and the cultural ecological traditions and knowledge around that practice, and in the need of safeguarding these practices from threats such as mountaintop removal. And she was really interested in how people use the spaces and how they continued to use the spaces even after the mountaintop removal, even after the establishment of like tourism in spaces separate from the mountaintop removal in West Virginia, how people still use those spaces and practice their traditions.
So, great, folklore has a rich history of environments. So I think the next question we're really interested in asking is, what does folklore pay attention to? What is the subject, the object, the collaborative communities with whom folklore works? If we are to have a folklore that, quoting Mary Hufford, glossing the Pope, is an ecologically adequate public folklore practice. So there are some things we've already done that are on this list here. We have paid attention to cultures of environmentalism and activism in response to slow and emergent environmental crises. We have paid attention to, for example, traditional ecological knowledge. There are also some practices and paradigms that are really current in folklore studies now that we think could be really rich when applied to environmental questions. Vernacular risk perception is a huge movement in folklore today. Folklorists such as Diane Goldstein and Andrea Kidda have worked in folkloristics of health and medicine to think about the ways that people perceive their own risk and the way that that gets transmitted through folklore genres. We think it would be really fantastic and right to apply this to, say, place-based environmental justice and risk perception. Another movement that we really are looking to in folkloristic studies is work around trauma, disaster, and response, and the applications of cultural work to being more robustly prepared for disasters to come. This work has happened by scholars such as Carl Lindahl, Kate Parker Horrigan around Katrina response, and we think that as the Anthropocene is ever more with us, there are many precarious environmental communities that are being disproportionately affected by Anthropocene change, who should be worked with around their own perspectives. And another key issue would be, we just go back here, the question of the stigmatized vernacular, which is something that's been pioneered by folklorists such as Amy Schumann and Farrell and Olivia Caldera, influenced by disability studies, Goffman's work, and beyond. So documenting cultures and practices that get deemed unsustainable, occupational cultures that are tied to extractive industry, coal, petrochemicals, cultures of mass consumption and disposability that EH, as an interventionist practice, is saying, are bad and will no longer serve. Well, is there a way that folklorists could work with and document those cultures, and what are the ethics of that sort of spur to transition or letting those sorts of cultures go? So up next, we have a couple of case studies. We're going to tell you about work that we have afoot right now and how we're trying to draw on this history to kind of speak to both environmental humanities and folkloristic practice in our own work and the attentions we pay.
Okay, so the project that I'm currently working on is a study about and around the 2014 Elk River chemical spill that happened in the Kanawha River Valley in West Virginia. What I'm trying to do is collect sort of oral histories and interviews about people's experiences during and after the spill, paying attention to how people make sense of this disaster and how people make sense of their experience living in the chemical valley more broadly. And I'm interested in the sort of untellability of speaking out against industries that have such a big hold on the economy and like even become sort of like traditional workplaces. And I'm interested in the vernacular risk perception, like we were talking about earlier, how people understand like how this is actually affecting them physically, and how they're making decisions about like are they moving away or what kind of decisions making they're going through after living through the spill. This project addresses some environmental humanities concepts such as timescales, like the idea of this urgent disaster versus the more broad, slow violence of living in the region. Like, how do we deal with something that is something that can be remediated quickly, such as the chemical spill and getting full water, versus the perception of harm over a longer, slower period of time. And another thing that I'm thinking through is this expectation to tell a new story about West Virginia, and how that's sort of problematized by the fact that this isn't a new story for the region, but it's also not a new story across multiple regions, especially as we're seeing water contamination issues popping up all over the Midwest because of coal, because of industry in general.
So one of the projects I'm working on right now is a collaboration with the Ohio Ecological Food and Farm Association, and I'm very interested in this project in documenting the performance and embodiment of ecological belief about food systems, food security, health, and the interconnections of all of those things in the way that farmers in Ohio in particular have adopted agricultural techniques in line with ecological farming practice, whether that is certified organic, whether that is biodynamics, permaculture, esoteric systems that combine lots of those different things. And I'm particularly interested in this project in looking at the rise of OFA itself as a codified certifying agency for organic farmers, but also an educational body and an advocacy body. So I'm really interested in the spaces of pedagogy and performance where farming gets politicized as tied to larger environmental issues such as fracking in northern Ohio, water issues, and kind of political and certification issues that affect farmers across the country, such as debates on GMO labeling, the Farm Bill, and questions in organizing around land conservancy acts and access to land or loan forgiveness for young farmers, things like that. So another project that I'm involved in as a part of a team with the Penn program in the environmental humanities based at the University of Pennsylvania in Philadelphia is a collaborative partnership in Eastwick, which is a neighborhood in southwest Philadelphia. We're working with a really prominent organizing group called the Eastwick Friends and Neighbors Coalition that for the last 4 years have done incredible work to mobilize the really rich and powerful and concerning history of development and environmental justice issues in the Eastwick community, which is a Philadelphia community built on a floodplain. It's been subject to lots of different urban renewal and structural racism efforts since the 50s, 60s, and 70s, hosts 2 Superfund sites. So we're working together with this organizing group to co-curate an oral history project and an exhibit and look at the power of modalities like walking tours or in-placed memory, not only to create solidarity and understanding of the Eastwick community's experience and of these multiple and rich attachments to place for people not from Eastwick, but to generate a toolkit that's going to be really useful for the Eastwick Friends and Neighbors Coalition's ongoing organizing and ongoing attempts to get folks in the community out and working together to have community sovereignty and control over what happens in Eastwick. And a third project that I'm just getting started working on is a project based on the history of River Valley High School in Marion, Ohio, which was in the news a lot in the late 1990s and early 2000s as being a school that was built after World War II on a World War II chemical waste depot. And there was a cancer cluster. A lot of folks from Marion County who had attended River Valley started getting cancer. And my mother attended River Valley High School, as did lots of her friends, all of her other family members. So this is how I kind of got to know the area and the story. So in this project, I'm really interested in particular in media reception and the role of the media and the role in local organizing and creating senses of place-based risk perception, place-based exposure, or cultures of concern, and also cultures of organizing to make something better. And I'm also really concerned about questions of local knowledge and the negotiation of expertise, the way knowledge gets solidified in family groups, in neighborhood groups, or more remotely. And I'm also interested in this genre that I'm calling incomplete knowledge that people live with. This is a quote from an interview I've done with my mother about what people do with knowledge of risk that they don't feel is totally definitive, that they're not quite sure about. So I think Bethany and I in our work are both interested in people who aren't necessarily activists, but live in the area. Do you want to talk a little bit about the forced option idea?
Yeah, drawing from like sociology of environmental controversies, it's sort of this idea of the forced option. It wasn't that these people went out kind of like looking for a cause, but they're sort of put into this position where they have to make one decision or the other. And I feel like that really rings true in a lot of the situations that we're talking about.
And I think in many Anthropocene communities, we're not just going to be dealing with scientists and local organized groups. There are lots of people who are all sorts of in between, who are navigating all these different medias, all these different personal experiences, are having to translate embodied experiences or senses of environment and risk, weigh those against the many other attachments they have to place. So we're really excited to do this kind of work that takes stock in the complexity of those sorts of concerns. So we're going to leave you in just a minute, but we want to talk a little bit about method first.
So just to kind of touch on some of the things we've already brought up, we really think that there's this need for methods that promote a close listening, which is something that folklore has a long history of doing. That is our practice. And so we're looking at sort of ethnographies, oral history-based work, and specifically community collaborative practice. So not only are we listening closely, but we're allowing the community we're working with to have a say in the work and also have an investment in the work so that it produces something that's useful to them in return. We're calling this community collaborative practice. Some might call it reciprocal work. But
and it also speaks to, I think, the rising interest in the environmental humanities community in doing public EH and in work that really matters and is interventionist and is for the good. So I think, as we've seen with the rise of digital humanities too, a lot of the new movements in the new mobile history and public history, there's a lot of hunger around new forms of scholarship, documentary forms, exhibition forms, digital humanities maps that link oral histories together across place. So we really think one of the things public folklorist history has to offer to EH is a really robust toolkit of the type of products we make and who gets a say and gets a slice of that authority in making those things together.
So folklore has something to learn from the environmental humanities too. And so one thing we're really interested in is what are the limitations to folklore's very localized attention, and how can folklore practice critique larger structures of power that are implicit in global ecological crisis, how we can critique those powers while at the same time paying attention to these local issues and listening that we're promoting so heavily.
We're also really interested in the problems of EH advocacy. Folklorists have long grappled with the issue of, we're a practice in a field that really does value close collaboration and shared authority, so we also kind of tend sometimes to only study groups and cultures we would want to support and get behind. Folklore has had a strong social justice leaning since the beginning, But unlike some other fields with really strong critiques of power, we tend not to study up or to work and do close ethnography with groups that we think maybe are like part of social problems, because how do you handle shared authority and collaboration then? Where is the point of intervention or critique? So we're really concerned about what this means in terms of environmental humanities work, because who gets to say what is sustainable and good for who? We live in a very transnational world where there are flows of infrastructure and toxicity and environments that are alienated between consumption and production. You know, people don't always and don't often see the impacts of the choices that they make. So is there a role for folklorists in documenting cultures that we think are unsustainable and what we've called in this slide kind of bad attachment? Is there a way that we can help in maybe like a process of grieving for cultural forms and practices and economic systems that have led to the situation we're in, but who gets to say that and on what level? Where does that get contested? We don't have answers to any of these things, but we think they're really ripe grounds for future discussion, and we really hope that for those of you who are have not been familiar with folklore practice, that we've made a good case for why this is a discipline that really has much to contribute to the ongoing EH conversation.
Yeah, we're really looking forward to hearing what you all have to say.
And we do have a brief Google Doc we've made up where we've listed some of the references organized by sort of area that we've drawn on and found inspiring in our work and mentioned in this slideshow. So please feel free to go there and check anything out if it's interested. We may also make it openly collaborative so that if any of you would like to add sources and have this be like a collective bibliography for all of us doing this vernacular, culturally based EH work. So it can be. Thank you so much.